What is a monster? Well, for the sake of this video, we're going to discount zombies, vampires, werewolves, and human villains because they each deserve videos of their own. Monsters take many forms, and the way they are depicted can tell us a lot of different things about the viewpoints of the people who made them. Monsters have been a quintessential part of horror film for as long as the genre has had a name. The term horror film was originally popularized as a way of marketing the Universal Monsters movies, whose most interesting and famous monster is of course Frankenstein's monster, or maybe Count Dracula, but whatever, we'll discuss vampires another time. The monster of these films is quite different to the more eloquent and more ambiguously immoral creature from Mary Shelley's novel. Here, the monster is depicted as a bewildered animal, confused by his existence and routinely attacked for being ugly. Played brilliantly by Boris Karloff, Frankenstein's monster was unusually ahead of its time because it was depicted with sympathy. He certainly does some questionable things, most notably inadvertently drowning a child, but it's not out of malice or even a predatory instinct. He does these things out of a sense of self-preservation, or as an attempt to fit into the world that has been thrust onto him, yet for reasons beyond his comprehension, seems to hate him. So when I tell you that James Whale, the English stage director who made the first two Frankenstein films, was gay, we can see that experience coming through in the film. Frankenstein's monster doesn't understand himself, he just knows that practically every person he comes across is afraid of him and wants him to be beaten into submission or even killed. Speaking as a gay person, I grew up feeling that same confusion and fear that I see in Boris Karloff's face. Things have progressed significantly since the early 1930s, but outward hostility leading to internalized hatred has certainly been a big part of my life. Now that's just one reading of the film and of the monster portrayed therein, but it goes to show that monsters can have real, important meaning. The following decades would see a surge in less complicated and generally less interesting monsters, from Universal's own Gill Man in The Creature from the Black Lagoon, to King Kong and the giant bugs of 50s sci-fi horror movies like Them and Tarantula, or the ridiculous giant rabbits in Night of the Lepus. These monsters were apex predators who came into contact with humanity just long enough to challenge our place at the top of the food chain, until they are killed by fighter planes or shot several times or burned with flamethrowers and napalm. Monsters such as these are generally made more interesting by their context. Godzilla is yet another giant animal, but as a pointed metaphor for the average person's helplessness in the face of a massive natural disaster, or in this instance the nuclear bombs dropped on Japan at the end of the Second World War, it becomes much more powerful. Roger Ebert once famously said, "For me, the movies are like a machine that generates empathy. It lets you understand a little bit more about different hopes, aspirations, dreams, and fears." Seeing the reactions of these innocent people as their lives are ripped apart and burned into ash gives us some small sense of what it would have been like to have lived in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and then to have your home, your whole city, destroyed in the blink of an eye. The best parts of Godzilla aren't the meetings of government officials, or the pulpy silliness of Dr. Serizawa and his oxygen destroyer device, which does eventually kill Godzilla. It's the shots of a monster rampaging through a city in flames, and the reactions of ordinary citizens to something they don't understand, destroying their homes and taking thousands of lives. The shark in Jaws goes for a similar effect, albeit far less seriously. The mayor of the small beach town of Amity Island is concerned only about keeping local businesses open for the summer season, not about the safety of his citizens. His insistence on keeping quiet about the shark results in the death of a young boy, and the shark turns the petty squabbling for money and political popularity into a farce when faced with the primal fear of being eaten alive. The shark is probably best known for its absence in the film because the mechanical shark was infamously faulty, so it's mostly depicted in the form of suggestion. We see point of view shots underwater looking up at people swimming, we see the occasional fin, and most importantly, John Williams' minimalistic theme for the shark keeps its presence at the forefront of our minds despite not being able to see it, which makes it 100 times scarier. We know there is danger out there, drawing closer, but we don't know where it's coming from. It taps into the same fear that made us afraid to go to the bathroom at night as children. Or was that just me? This use of unsettling paranoia inspired some of the best horror films ever made in the 70s and 80s, most notably the xenomorphs of the Alien franchise and the shape-shifting alien in John Carpenter's version of The Thing. Both of these films feature alien parasites who can infect people and turn them into dangers for those around them. The xenomorph does this through probably the best example of a biologically plausible monster's life cycle ever put to film. It latches onto its prey out of an egg and essentially impregnates them with a larval form of itself, which then bursts out of their victim's chest, killing them. Within a few hours, it's fully grown and is almost impossible to kill. We only see the alien in glimpses and flashes throughout the film, and the ship's design is such that it could hide in an almost infinite number of places. But it's the primal fear of infection and violent rape that gives the xenomorph such an unnerving power. Similarly, the Thing from The Thing can disguise itself in any form, originally taking the shape of a dog. It slowly kills the inhabitants of an Antarctic research station until we don't know who is human and who is a parasitic alien. This monster has more in common with the pod people from both versions of Invasion of the Body Snatchers than it does to the depiction in the 1950s version, except when cornered it shows its true grisly form in some amazing sequences using practical effects. The Thing has an outstanding blend of creeping paranoia as we wonder who we can trust, and over-the-top monster mayhem whenever it's discovered. The film ends with the only two remaining characters staring at each other, both unsure if the other is human or not, and resigning themselves to their deaths at the ruined facility, which is engulfed in flames that are slowly dying out. One of the more interesting monsters in film history comes from David Cronenberg's The Fly, which begins with a scientist who has an air of Dr. Frankenstein about him, but slowly transforms into his own Frankenstein's monster. Like The Thing, it has some amazing practical effects as we see Jeff Goldblum's Dr. Brundle turn into the hideous Brundlefly. He begins as a slightly weird and awkward guy who nevertheless has a lot of confidence in himself and his scientific abilities. He's created a teleportation machine, and when he tests it on himself, not realizing that a fly has entered his telepod with him, he comes out the other side feeling great. But the fly has fused with his DNA, and Brundle's need to prove himself and his inherent narcissism are both distorted to alarming degrees. He becomes obsessed with his physical power and aggressive towards anyone who questions him. Over time, he transforms, slowly at first, then more and more rapidly, turning into a human-fly hybrid called Brundlefly. His increasingly erratic and dangerous behavior drives everyone away, and he ends up as a desperate, disgusting creature.
Saying I'm an insect who dreamt he was a man and loved it. But now the dream is over. And the insect is awake.
Brundle's transformation from Dr. Frankenstein analog to the monster is, like Frankenstein, more tragic than it is frightening. It's got some great gross out effects, but the fly is actually quite profoundly sad. Brundle seemed to have a bright future ahead of him, but his hubris got the better of him, and by the time he realizes what he has lost, it's too late. In the end, his former lover euthanizes him. The vanquishing of the monster would be a triumphant moment in most films, but this isn't a triumph, it's a tragedy. The Fly has such a downer ending that you almost forget the film is mostly remembered for being one of the great body horrors. The effects are fantastic to be sure, but I find the transformation and ultimate unraveling of Brundle's character to be far more compelling than his physical metamorphosis alone. In more recent years, monsters have been domesticated. They're not sources of fear anymore, or not exclusively at least, but rather objects of fun. Monsters Inc. uses the idea of monsters for visual jokes and as a vague allegory about renewable energy, which is highly entertaining, but surprisingly has ended up looking more dated than many of the older movies we've discussed. Similarly, the Hulk from the Marvel Cinematic Universe has gone from an uncontrollable rage monster into more of a comic relief character, particularly in Thor Ragnarok, where we see the Hulk in a prolonged speaking role for the first time. These films aren't bad, in fact they're actually really good, but their treatment of monsters is pretty surface level. They aren't really central to any of the themes in the films, so much as they're just there for fun creature designs and cool action set pieces, which is fine, but I personally actually find monsters a lot more interesting when they haven't been so thoroughly defanged. That's not to say that there haven't been any good monsters in the past few years. The Babadook and It from It Follows, and I suppose Pennywise from It, have all had interesting subtexts about grief and sexuality and innocence. Most recently, the creatures from A Quiet Place take the monster as predator angle from Jaws and all those 50s monster movies, but with the novel twist that they stalk their prey using sound, so the characters have to stay silent using sign language and walking barefoot on trails of sand. It creates a fantastically tense atmosphere, and the slightest noise brings a lurch of fear with it. Each movie monster is different. Some are metaphors for serious issues that make us think about real-world tragedies, some are made to elicit our sympathy, some are used for comic effect, and some are just big scary murderous creatures. Regardless of intent, when done well, monsters are among the most imaginative and interesting characters we have in horror cinema. There is of course a canon of monsters that are conspicuously absent from this video, those from the mind of Guillermo del Toro. Don't worry though, we'll get to that soon. But for now, let's take a moment to appreciate monsters.